Just about everybody in Toledo has heard a story about a Native American village or a Native American graveyard being located right below their home or their school or their church or something. And in most cases, it's just not true. But that doesn't mean that Native nations didn't have important settlements here before this was the Glass City. Hi again, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. This is our first kind of lecture day in A-Push, which I'm super excited about. It's strange for me doing these lectures online because the thing I love about lectures, and this is going to sound nuts, I really like being interrupted and having people ask questions, and there's really none of that on here. So please email me questions, like ask questions on Classroom. I want to know what you think about this stuff. I want to know what's not clear. And don't feel like you're going to look dumb, like if you're thinking the question everybody else is. And about 70% of the time, I don't have the answer anyways, because I do not know everything. I just don't. And honestly, let's be real here for a minute. Anybody who tells you they do know everything about history is lying. So, anyways, ask your questions. Let me launch right into it, folks. This is the longest period of history we are ever going to talk about in this class. Most of the time when we talk about something, it'll be something that happened over the course of a couple days, couple weeks, couple months, couple years. This time we're talking about from the Ice Age to 1500. We're talking about like a 16,000 year cycle here. So there's no time to waste. Let's get into it. When you look at this physical map, let me get rid of myself here, which is always probably a good idea anyways. When you look at this map, look at what you see about North America, okay? Just look at what kind of landforms we're talking about and where those landforms occur. And hopefully what you're seeing is that if you were going to describe North America to a man from Mars, you'd say there's a huge range of mountains that run down the west, that the mountains cover almost all the west. And then it's real flat in the middle. And then there's another smaller group of mountains over in the east. And there's water to the left, water to the right, water below. Right now, water up above. Used to be ice, but those were the days. And you'd notice that, number one, there's these mountains that go along. There's this flat area in the middle. Few mountains over on the side. You would also notice how close Asia is to us up here. In the Bering Sea, you are very, very close in the Bering Straits from Asia to North America. And that becomes a fairly important plot point as we're talking about the peopling of the Americas. So the migration of Homo sapiens, the migration of humans, as we see, Homo neanderthals lived Europe, Southern Asia, Homo erectus, North Africa, Middle East, South of Asia, and then we see Homo sapiens who come about. They're going to spread out over time, right? And so the peopling of Africa is happening in the 200,000 years ago range. Europe, 40,000 years ago. Asia, 70,000 years ago. Most of Russia, 25,000 years ago. Australia, 50,000 years ago. Micronesia, 30,000 years ago. And then we notice it takes a while for people to get into what's going to become the United States and the Canadian Arctic and down into South America. It's about 15,000 years BC, so about 17,000 years ago, that people are able to cross this land bridge at Bering and then basically follow the west coast down into South America. So if you guys think about this, your oldest civilizations are going to be found up here. Hold on just a minute, I got a phone call. Okay, so what I was getting at is your oldest civilizations are going to be in the north. Your younger civilizations are going to be at the tail end of these arrows, right? So we are going to be some of the younger civilizations in the Americas around where we live. And then certainly the Inuit people in the north are going to be some of the younger civilizations within the Americas as people moved around. So, oh, come on, don't do me like this. There we go. Peopling. Peopling is one of our big concepts in AP Gov, or AP US History. Good gravy. All right. So About 33,000 years ago, about 35,000 years ago, 33,000 BCE, before the Common Era, the first people crossed the Bering Land Bridge. And then about 15,000 years after that, the migration picks up. And they go down through Alaska and Canada, through the current U.S., like Washington, Oregon, California coast, heading down along the Mexico Pacific coast into South and Central America. As we fast forward to about 1492, there's about 54 million people living in North and South America and the islands of the Caribbean. They are split into 2,000 linguistic groups. That's 2,000 different languages. And in those language groups, there are multiple nations. In those nations, there are multiple tribes. In those tribes, there are multiple families. So they're a really diverse people. And it's why it's really kind of infuriating when we think about Native Americans. You know, that's like saying Europeans or Asians. Like, who are you? Or even worse, because Americans are terrible about this, Africans. Like, Americans act like Africa is a country half the time. And it's silly, right? Because, like, if you're talking about Africa, you could be talking about anybody from, you know, white settlers, the Boers of South Africa. You could be talking about the Great Zimbabwe. You could be talking about, you know, the Mali cultures. You could be talking about the Berbers in the north. You could be talking about radically different people in Africa. And it's the same thing with Native Americans. Go back to the earliest ones you remember from, like, your early civs classes, like the Mayan and the Inca. Those are radically different cultures. And those cultures are radically different from, like, the Eastern Woodland people that lived where we live now. So always remember that it's just a gross oversimplification. When you say Indian or Native American, it's almost a useless term in describing anybody except saying that they lived on two enormous continents. All right? So I hope we got that out of the way first. Around 5,000 BCE, so about 7,000 years ago, people start growing corn. And this begins in Mexico. Different nations in Mexico start growing corn or maize, and it changes them. Instead of being nomadic herding cultures who kind of follow the herds of animals around, they become farming village cultures, and they settle down. Now, once you settle down, what does that mean? It means you have to have people who can build things. You are going to have some people who farm, some people who process the stuff that gets farmed, some people who make stuff out of the stuff that gets farmed. So when we're talking about corn and maize, what we're really talking about is making flour and bread. And this is going to sound crazy to you guys, but this doesn't exist in the Americas until corn growing comes about, and corn cultivation results in flour and bread and all, and you know, not necessarily noodles as we would understand them, but like mush and stuff like that. They're going to be able to make food that lasts all year. You take that corn crop, you turn it into flour, you seal it up. That's going to be food that lasts you through the winter. You've made yourself a durable society. And it means people are going to specialize in new jobs. And so this is when you're going to see the rise of, like, religious leaders and warriors and chiefs and councils and things like that. You're going to have a complex society. Now, the word they use for this in history is civilization, and that's kind of a loaded term a lot of times, because a lot of times civilization for Americans means whatever it was that came out of Europe and came over here. And that's not the way we're talking about civilization in here. We're talking about it in the sense that you have a structured society, multiple options, a lifestyle that centers around one place. You create a complex society. That's what we mean by civilization in here. And it's not to say that the people before that were uncivilized at all. So I hope that's pretty clear. Another thing that was made possible by corn was resistance. If your people had the ability to have a geographic base of operations, if your people could eat even when there wasn't food on the ground because you were able to store foods, it meant you were able to resist. And the societies that were more established were better able to resist attacks from their neighbors and then the attacks that are going to come from overseas. One of the big things that comes about in the last basically 6,000 years was what they called the three sister farming. And the three sisters were squash, beans, and corn. And you grew these together. You may remember this from your early America classes in 8th grade, but Who remembers anything from 8th grade? Like, not this guy. The Three Sister farming was amazing because the corn stalks grew tall and the squash it grows on the ground, right? Like melons grow on the ground and stuff. That protected the root system for the corn. So the squash helped the corn grow. The corn, being tall, could be used as a trellis for the beans to grow up. So it was like a mutually advantageous, I know there's a science word I'm looking for here and I can't come up with it right now, where symbiotic. It was a symbiotic relationship between these three crops where they all provided the things that the other crop needed. And it was a very sustainable form of agriculture. Native North America, in the most basic terms, and we're going to look at some more complicated maps than this in a little bit. Eastern woodland, this is us, okay? Hunter-gatherer people. So they are going to establish villages, but they're still going to hunt. They're still going to gather forage from the forests and whatnot. Out on the Great Plains, you have the bison hunters, the people who follow the bison from north to south and back again. Out in what is today like Montana, Wyoming, eastern Washington, you have fishermen and hunter-gatherers in the streams coming out of the mountains. All along the Pacific coast, you have the people who are hunters and fishers because they've got that waterway to kind of support them. Desert hunter-gatherers, the maize farmers that we just talked about down in Mexico, the Olmecs who are down there at the base of the Yucatan. You've got the Poverty Point culture in here. Caribbean hunter-gatherers. And then up in the Arctic, we really won't spend a lot of time talking about that. This is the more complex map I was talking about, and I love this map. So this is a map kind of reflecting the cultural and linguistic areas of Native Americans as it exists around the year 1500. So about the time that Europeans are coming to the Americas, this is sort of the way things are. And we're going to zoom in on that. And of course, hopefully you all know, we live here. We are the west end of Lake Erie. And there's the Maumee River going all the way back to what's today Fort Wayne, Indiana. And if you can see here, the specific people that lived here were the Erie Indians, and they were sometimes called the Cat People. You probably don't recognize the place behind me. I'm on the east side, all the way at the end of Summit Street, across Millard, down by Otter Creek, and right behind those trees behind me is where the Maumee River meets Lake Erie. Today it's a big shipyard and rail yard, but 300 years ago this was a place that French explorers called Presqu'Île, and in the 1600s it was the site of a village of Erie Nation people, some of the earliest Toledoans that we know about. A century later, it was home to an Ottawa village, and later it was the home of Peter Navarre, one of our great Toledoans. They were part of this same group as some of the most famous Native American nations in our nation's history, the Iroquois Confederacy, and they all spoke Iroquoian languages. The Erie spoke an Iroquoian language, the Susquehanna over in western PA, and then the 5 tribes of the Iroquois Confederation. See if I can remember them since I can't read them here. The Mohawk, then there's 2 O's, Cayuga and Seneca, because that's how I always had to remember them, was M-O-O-C-S. Okay, can I actually see this if I get close? Onondaga and the Oneida. And then just off to the west of us were the Miami. And the Miami Indians, later, by the time you get to the 1700s, the Miami Nation is going to be in near Toledo. You've got the Potawatomi up here in Michigan. They're going to start moving south. The Sauk and Fox and the Kickapoo and all these different nations up here. And then along the East Coast, you've got the Native Americans that are going to be the ones that I hate to even admit, you read about them very badly when you learned the Thanksgiving story back in the day. And these are going to be a bunch of other different linguistic groups. So, histories of change. When we talk about all these different nations, one of the things to think about, these nations are all about the size of European nations, right? The Netherlands is a tiny country. Belgium is a tiny, tiny country. Luxembourg is a tiny country. The Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg was a tiny country. All of these Indian nations were about the same size as the European nations. And it's kind of fun to think about that, we tend to think all Native Americans were the same when in fact they were organized into nations pretty much like the Europeans. And much like the Europeans, different nations competed for trade, different nations fought over their borders. Just like back in Europe, the borders changed. When there was a war, the borders changed. Sometimes people linked together, like the Iroquois Confederacy up there. Separate nations that all came together as one. And then they're going to mix it up with the Erie from time to time. They're going to mix it up with the Ottawa when the Ottawa come from the north. Their borders are going to change. So it's really interesting when we think about like whose land we live on in Toledo. Well, the last Native American nation it was the Ottawa, and the Ottawa had been there for hundreds of years by the time European settlers got there. But it had also been Erie land. It had also belonged to these woodland nations whose names have been lost to us. Adaptations. People in all these different regions of the countries adapted to their environment, and sometimes they bent the environment to their needs. And this is still us today, right? We adapt to our environment, and we try to bend the environment to our needs, like air conditioning, which I desperately wish I had in this garage right now. People in different regions of the country adapt to their environment. They bend it to their needs. So the Plains Nations, they hunted bison. That's what they had. They lived in mobile communities. That's how they adapted to their environment. Northwest nations, the people of the Pacific Northwest, their lives centered on fish and water. The Mississippian cultures along the Mississippi River Valley, they were able to farm. They were able to create larger communities. One of the biggest cities in the world at the time of Columbus's discovery is a city called Cahokia, which was close to St. Louis. It was bigger than London. It had more people than London when Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean blue in 1492. The Pueblo Nations down in New Mexico, Arizona area, the Pueblo Nations created really, really crazy irrigation networks, like the kind of engineering we are hard-pressed to come up with. And they found ways to get what little water they had into fields so they could cultivate maize as well. They lived in cliff dwellings, nestled into the rock and the shade of the rock. It kept them from overheating and stuff. It's all brilliant, right? In some ways, you have to ask, who's smarter, them or us? We try so hard to bend the environment to our will, and we spend billions of dollars and tons of energy to do it, whereas they were a lot smarter about the way they adapted to the environment instead of trying to adapt the environment to themselves. All right, near us. As I said, we live in the land of the ancient Woodland people, the Eastern Woodland people, who lived here between about 800 BC and 1200 CE. Among those Woodland people, the ones who you're probably the most aware of were the Hopewell. And the Hopewell were the mound builders. And you probably learned about these guys when you were in your 5th grade Ohio history, which again, I don't expect you to remember. But do you remember learning about like the Serpent Mound down by Chillicothe, or any of the other like burial mounds that were made in parts of Ohio, even within an hour's drive of Toledo? If you go up near Pioneer, Ohio, there are burial mounds up there. So the Woodland people were here. And then also there were the Sandusky people. And the Sandusky people established villages in northwest Ohio, sedentary villages, like settled villages of a few hundred people, by the time we get to around 1000 CE, so about 3,000 years ago. By the time we reach 1500, like 8 years after Columbus's first voyage, the Woodland people are gone. By the time you get to Columbus, the Woodland people aren't around here anymore. And at that time, a lot of different Native American nations are claiming their different homes around northwest Ohio. So as you go around northwest Ohio, it's sometimes hard to say whose land was this. So for example, when we're thinking about each of our Toledo public schools, like if you wanted to say this was so-and-so's land, it's not always easy to determine that. Much of it was the land of the Ottawa. Now, you've seen that spelled O-T-T-A-W-A your whole life, because that's Ottawa Park, Ottawa Tavern, Ottawa River, right? But the way they spell it today, because remember, they weren't spelling things with the letters that we have. They weren't spelling things with our alphabet. They were spelling it with the alphabets they had. And so you have to do something not just called translation, you have to do transliteration. You have to change it from somebody else's characters into ours. It's the same thing we do with Chinese or Russian or Romanian. We have to move them into, actually, I think Romanian is in our script, but I could be wrong about that. Arabic, for instance. You have to translate it not just what the word means, but how it's going to be spelled using our character system. So the most recent, and it's been accepted for about 25 years, generally speaking, the Ottawa people spell it O-D-A-W-A. So when you see me writing what looks like Ottawa, that's the Ottawa. That's the Ottawa that you're familiar with. The Ottawa lived in a lot of Toledo, but not all of it. There were also Seneca people around us, Wyandotte people, especially to the south and east of us, and Miami people, especially to the west, as you go upriver on the Maumee River. Further upriver you go on the Maumee, the more likely you are to be among the Miami people, who also have been transliterated in far different ways than M-I-A-M-I. Okay, bottom line. Most important thing to take away from this. Societies in the Americas were every bit as complex and multinational and multi-ethnic as those in Europe. These were not all the same people. You couldn't transplant a person who was a Sioux on the Great Plains and drop him into an Ottawa culture and expect him to know what was going on. He's not going to speak the language, know the customs. They're going to seem very foreign to him. As if you took an Iroquois from upstate New York and dropped him among the Chinook people up by Seattle, Washington. They'd have no idea what was going on. They were completely different places. And again, if we think about Europe, this would be like a Russian in 1400 being able to communicate with somebody in Portugal. Like, the odds are very small. You're going to recognize that each other are human, but you're going to have no idea what they're saying. Let's be honest, we're Americans. All we would have to do is drive to Quebec right now, 8 hours from here, and be among French speakers, and we'd be like, yeah, Frenchie, I know you're human, but I don't know what you're talking about. It would be the same thing back then. They were very different people, different nations, different ethnicities, different cultures, different beliefs. Just like Europe, just like Asia, just like Africa. So, I hope this has been somewhat informative to you guys. And if there's one thing I wish this class had more focus on, it was or would be kind of our Native American history around here, because it's absolutely fascinating, and it absolutely should reflect who we can be, kind of being more in harmony with nature. So anyways, that's all I got for y'all today. Thank you for sticking it out with me here, and have a good day. Take care. Bye.